So lately I've been hearing a lot of complaints from support and tank mains that their voices aren't really being heard, and while looking at all of those and looking at DPS mains voices and all of it together, I've kind of thought about the question, does Overwatch love DPS players? Does it listen to them more than other roles? And if that's not even the case, does the game kind of support DPS players more than other roles? Today I want to talk about all those, if it does or if it doesn't. Now I do want to state right here that I know that is not the case that Jeff only loves DPS players, or whoever's balancing the game only loves DPS players. Game developers like everybody that's playing their game. They want everybody that's playing their game to be happy, and maybe they're focusing on one group more than the other because there's more people there, and I think that's mainly one of the big things. But even though I think guaranteed, the developer team doesn't love one group more than the other, to some players it might feel that way. And today I kind of want to talk about ways that the game kind of pushes this narrative, ways that the developers have kind of somewhat pushed this narrative, even on accident, and as well, I guess, talk about why it's not all so doom and gloom for everybody, and why you shouldn't just be, straight up quitting the game just because you feel like in some cases DPS players are getting a little more love than other roles. With that all said though, guys, let's get started. Now I should begin here saying, as well, yes, I do know that DPS has a lot of problems, are ignored for quite a while. There's a lot of DPS that just never get changed, so please keep in mind I'm not completely ignoring the role. But I feel like I hear a lot more complaints from other roles about DPS than from DPS players about other roles, so that's why I'm coming at this topic from this angle, because I think it'll apply to generally a few more people. Now, straight off to the first thing about Overwatch, loving DPS players, I feel like a lot of people kind of cite the fact that DPS generally gets the most balance changes. And I think one thing that kind of skews the statistic a little bit is that they do have the most heroes by far. They have the most people that need to be balanced, the most people that have to be changed, the highest probability of being overpowered or underpowered. But even though that is the case, a lot of the time it also feels like, the developers just put a few more hours fixing up DPS and are more willing to rework their kits or more willing to change them up, because it has been quite a while since we've been seeing anything happening to tanks at all. It's been quite a while since we've seen way too many changes happening to supports, but it feels like DPS get changes all the time. And while again, that might not always be the exact case of what is actually happening, it does sometimes feel like that's what's happening, and I feel like a lot of support players and tank players feel like they're getting the short end of the stick because they're just being ignored. Their changes aren't being put through. Reinhardt still feels like crap after months of just him not working and months of his kit just being all jank, and overall there's just, I think, a few more situations where it's kind of easy to point out, hey, DPS is getting all these changes, these other roles aren't. And again, even though it might just be the way that the ball bounces, that statistically there are more DPS, it does still feel kind of bad for these other players. And I know quite a few players that are tank mains or that are support mains that just kind of stop playing because they feel like their characters are just never going to really fit in anymore. And maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. That's just what a lot of people feel like. And I should say here that people quitting the game isn't oftentimes based off of, facts or statistics. It's just based off what they feel like. So that's what I'm trying to explain here. Because, we can't see all the facts in the world. Overwatch doesn't give those out. All I can say is mainly what I've personally felt and what I've heard from a lot of people near me. Now, to the next point, I've heard of a lot of players complaining that DPS players complain all the time about everything and always get their way compared to every other role. And I think, again, this is one of those things that in most cases is not the case. The developer team really does want to listen to everybody, but I think the reason why it might feel this way is, again, because they are the largest group. And if they have the largest group, they're the group that Overwatch and the developer team probably want to cater to the most because they will be appealing the most people at one time. If you're trying to appeal to the Reinhardt mains, there aren't many of those left, while if you're appealing to the DPS mains that happen to flex, that does satisfy a few more people. And while that might be kind of annoying to think about, that's just kind of how the game has changed right here. And I think if I was a developer, I'd probably try to satisfy the most amount of people at the same time as well. Now, a problem that I see about this is that if you are somewhat catering to DPS, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, I don't know, but if you do happen to be doing this, you're going to be getting more DPS players because people think, hey, this is the role everyone's being listened to. I'll switch to that role. It's the role that's the best role, whatever. So, you cater the DPS, you get more DPS players, and then they have a larger voice, and the cycle continues over and over and over again. When Overwatch was first released, of course, there were more DPS players than any other role, but I feel like there was also a good amount of tank players and a good amount of support players. Support actually, maybe not the best, but as time has gone on, it feels like DPS has gotten a greater and greater voice. Tanks' voices have pretty much just kind of gone out the window. There's not too many of those anymore. And supports has actually been okay. But mainly again for tanks, it feels like, you know, they can't really complain and get their way while other roles can. And even though, again, that might not be the case, and even though, again, there probably are a lot of people in the development team listening to tank players, it feels like more changes than not really aren't supporting them. And that's why a lot of people, I think, again, kind of throw a little bit of hate towards DPS players. I think a good example for a long time was Tracer, because it felt like a lot of the times, you know, Tracer just had a ridiculous win rate, could do so much, but she was staying very good. She wasn't going to get any nerfs because there was a lot of people shouting that they don't want their main to be nerfed, that they don't want their DPS character to be nerfed. And even though in a lot of cases that probably wasn't how it was, even though there was probably, you know, stuff with statistics in the back end that only Blizzard can see, and, you know, the skill gap of this character and everything that makes it really hard for you to change her, to a tank player, it did still feel like, you know, they're just ignoring the best characters being too strong. And I guess at the same time, just because they have a lot of voice for them, while at the same time just not buffing any of the weakest characters because there's nobody really yelling to get those guys at a higher win rate or a stronger state. And again, this is a hard thing to really say who's right, say who's wrong, but you can see how that could, in some cases, make some people a little bit unhappy because it feels like nothing's really going well for them, and it feels like everything's being thrown to the other side of the table. And everybody likes when stuff happens that's good for them, so yeah, there you go with that. Now, to my next point here, I feel like, in general, competitive mode does inherently support DPS players. And this isn't, you know, a good or bad thing, it's just kind of what has ended up happening. One-tricking DPS has shown by many, many occasions to be the best way to rank up by far. A DPS can fit the most team comps. DPS can, generally, if you're good enough, play 3 to 4 of them, while if you're playing tanks in a meta where they aren't that good, yeah, you can't do that at all. Playing 3 or 4 supports, yeah, you can't do that at all. But DPS, at least in this mode, can do fine with that as well. And it's kind of annoying as the other roles because you can't do that. And it feels like sometimes the mode is just kind of supporting one way of play. And it's kind of annoying because it essentially leads to a lot of not the best team comps. And then that's just not the most fun thing to play with when you're playing one of these other roles, when you're trying to fill to just make a good team comp, to have a good competitive experience. The actual competitive mode, I feel like, oftentimes doesn't actually support this. And even though esports does support this, and even though in esports we get a lot of really good comps and really good plays, again, the competitive mode is very different. And I should say right here that, you know, DPS having the most impact on the game is fine. That's just kind of how the game has rounded out to be, and it does change depending on every single meta. But you could kind of see how for a decent amount of tank players or decent amount of support players, by season 10, they're getting a little bored of getting into games and feeling like they're just rolling a dice if they have the best DPS players or not. And in a lot of cases, I think if you're one of these players, you're wrong in the way you're thinking. As a tank player and a support player, you can change the game. You can really win your team that game if you are playing much better than the enemy support or the enemy tank. But a lot of the times it feels like you can't do that, and it feels like your DPS is the one that really has to carry that game and that has to put the load on their shoulders, and you're just kind of helping them up a little bit. A lot of the times it's not the case. You should change your mindset on that, but I think for many people, they kind of complain as if it was the way that everything went. And I guess the final thing I'm going to go with here about Overwatch, I guess, kind of supporting DPS inherently, is that DPS can fit the most variety of team cons, I think I'm going to say in general. There are, of course, a huge variety of DPS players and characters, I mean, so that does make sense. You know, they can fit really whatever they need, no matter what the meta is. But as well, other than that, I feel like as a DPS player, you can ignore your team comp the easiest. If you are a godlike McCree, sure, you are not very useful for dive, but if you're good enough at getting out damage, you can do it. If you're a godlike Pharah, again, you know, until you get to like Masters at GM, you're not really good at all with dive, but if you're good enough, you can do it. And I guess you could say with tank, you can kind of do the same thing, but a lot of the times if you're picking up Orisa on a dive comp when everyone else on your team's playing dive, you're pretty much just throwing that game completely, and you're just not going to work at all. And overall, I feel like the game just feels like DPS can fit more slots without having to be nearly as flexible, and I think that's why there's so many more DPS players that just play their favorite characters, no matter what the meta is, no matter what's happening. And what that can do for a lot of people is just kind of make you dislike these players because they aren't willing to swap while you kind of have to, and it might feel a little bit unfair in that way. I personally don't know exactly how you could fix this. This is just kind of how the game works. And I feel like maybe even it's fine if that's how the game works. It's okay for different characters and different roles to have different things that they can do. But again, that might be one of the reasons why some people think the DPS get a little bit too much love, just because inherently the game somewhat supports doing stuff that people don't really like their teammates to be doing. And there you go with that. I guess that's my last thing I want to say today about Overwatch, maybe loving DPS players. Now, I'm going to say right here that if you're a tank main or a support main that's quitting the game just because you feel like DPS are getting too much love, you really shouldn't. I mean, if you've been enjoying the game for a long time, the game's still essentially what it's been for a long time. Sure, there are some changes that feel like they are supporting DPS, but again, if it's an enjoyable time for you, don't get too stuck up on people, don't get too stuck up, I guess, on the politics of DPS, support, and tank. It doesn't matter way too much. Just try to have fun if you can. And if it's just really not having fun on your favorite characters for a while, I guess go and play something else until there are some changes that support you. And I guess if those never happened, well, at least you had a good time in the past when you could play your favorite characters and when they were working out well. And as well, you DPS players, I do realize that, the game isn't all roses for you guys. There are some bad things happening. And in a lot of cases, it feels like sometimes your voices are ignored for other people, especially in earlier seasons with like tank meta and stuff like that. I do understand that, and I do also understand that there are a lot of DPS players that aren't playing meta DPS that are ignored for a long time, and I think as well those characters should be buffed up, should be fixed so that they can be picked about the same rate as other DPS. But we can't always, I guess, get exactly what we want, but do understand that I kind of understand your guys' point of view as well. I've had a DPS Smurf account for the longest time, only played on that role, so I think I do really understand kind of how that mindset works as well. I'm mainly just trying to mainly play DPS. With all that said though, guys, thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. This was just as always my own opinion, so if you have your own opinion, leave that down in the comment section down below. Do you think Overwatch loves DPS players, or do you think that they don't love DPS players and the game is kind of developed against those? I'd really like to hear that and see what you guys have to say down below. Anyways, as always, guys, though, thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you thought this was a pretty interesting topic. I'm trying to get as many interesting topics as possible and trying to stop just making tip videos on the same thing over and over again because, it's been 2 years. But I guess if you didn't like the video, tell me that as well, and I can go back to making some more tip videos. I'll do whatever you guys think is important, but I do think that this was a pretty fun thing to talk about, so I hope you guys liked this and hope you guys are willing to see more in the future. Anyways, as always, guys, though, thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hit that subscribe button to see more videos like this in the future. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.